Hello, this is Sophie from Fotografiska. Is this working? Yes, it is. So welcome everyone. This is the fourth of 5 talks that we're doing with AIPAD, collecting for everyone. And this one is on photographic ephemera. So we'll probably discuss for about 45 minutes. We're going to show some slides. We've got some lovely objects as well. And then we'll open it up to you guys for questions. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce the panel this evening. We're joined by the directors of Daniel Oliver Gallery, Daniel Moyer and Oliver Lott, founded in 2018. It's a New York-based gallery with a primary focus on unique photographic archives, albums, collections, and vernacular works. The gallery's democratic approach to the medium highlights the varied uses of photography throughout its brief but rich history, examining relationships between utilitarian photographs and their fine art counterparts. So you can go and find them in Williamsburg, I believe. You're moving soon, but yep. And joining us is Patrick Montgomery, a producer, director, and film and photography archivist and avid collector. Alongside his film work, he founded and ran Archive Films Archive Photos, the largest commercial film and photo archive in the US until its acquisition by ImageBank in 1997. In 2007, Patrick formed Archive Farms, Inc. to manage the archival film and photo collections he'd acquired or assembled since selling to the ImageBank, most notably the Travel Film Archive, which owns the collections of several important travelogue filmmakers, including Burton Holmes, Andre de la Vere and James Fitzpatrick, and the Burt Morgan Archive, which he acquired from the heirs of Society photographer Burt Morgan in 2009. The company also represents the Caribbean Photo Archive and the History of Photography Archive, 2 private collections of the 19th century assembled by Montgomery over a 10-year period. He is a massive collector, and within that has also amassed a considerable amount of ephemera. So I guess the first question really, which is an obvious one, is I'd love to ask each of you what ephemera means to you. It's a very broad topic to discuss, but it'd be interesting to hear what it means to you. Patrick, do you want to go first?
Yeah, okay. So technically, ephemera means things that are produced for a reason, for temporarily, like a poster or a brochure or an advertisement or something like that. I think in terms of photo collecting, we like to expand that to include things that basically contain photographs but are not photographs. You'll see many examples when we get on there, but collateral things, things perhaps used to sell photographs made by dealers, but also just unusual things that incorporate a photograph in some way. That's sort of my definition.
Did you guys want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, postcards, matchbooks, all these kind of throwaway pieces of paper that we sort of tend to hold on to and keep. The list is really endless of kind of different types of photographic ephemera.
Right, yeah. It's a funny thing. It's like the first thing one naturally collects, the memento, the concert ticket, whatever it is. So, yeah, speaking about photographic ephemera, I guess it's basically, I think it's, in this context, either ephemera, that printed matter that tells the history of photography, or, as Patrick said, photographs that have been used to enhance or help construct pieces of ephemera, be they advertising tools or whatever it may be.
It's sort of really, in a way, the use of photography as a communication medium versus the fine art piece.
Right.
I mean, at Fotografiska, we exhibited quite a lot around posters or concert tickets or zines or that kind of thing. So it's a very, very broad area to collect in. We were talking earlier about how it gets quite particular and quite specific for those interested in it because it is so broad. And I think we've all got postcards on our mantelpieces. I mean, it's really something that we all have somewhere, I think, in our homes. But these guys are the experts. My time at Magnum Photos, I had within our group of photographers Martin Parr, who is also a very important British collector as well as a photographer. He actually had an entire exhibition called Power World, which was his obsessive collecting of photographic ephemera, from Saddam Hussein carpets to watches to etc., etc. So you can really go down a rabbit hole with this, which is what's so wonderful about it. So I guess the next question really for you is what I think we should dive into what we've got, actually, because I think that given that it is so particular, there's so many ways this could go. Shall we take some examples up on the screen and start? So you can see what we're talking about. In the case of some very beautiful early, what are these? Exhibition catalogues?
Well, these are some of the, I think the first things in the slideshow are from my collection, and I tried to, my collection is basically a history of photography collection, so I have a lot of things that were produced in the 19th and early 20th century to sell photographs, posters, brochures, catalogs, things like that. And then, so which is what you see on this side is a catalog from a MoMA exhibition. Now snapshots, vernacular photographs have become very popular, but in 1944, they actually had an exhibition of snapshots at MoMA. So that's a catalog for that. At the other end of ephemera, this is a promotion for some matches made in Australia that has Daguerre's face on it. Don't ask me why. I'm not sure he's a big seller in Australia, but anyway, it's a matchbook cover from Australia.
Yeah. Do you have any guesses as to why? I mean, are there different famous people on each of the numbers, or is it something to do with illumination? Like,
this is the only one I've seen, but since it's number 21, my guess is that they had a series of famous people, and I don't know how famous Daguerre is in Australia, but anyway, that's what that is.
And I think what's interesting as well, we were talking about this, we've obviously done a talk on, I don't know how many of you saw the talk that we did, the initial one we did on book collecting, and I think we were talking earlier again about how this area as well sort of leads you down the rabbit hole of design and typography and lots of other things, and the combination of word and image, and there's lots of lovely ways to go in terms of the fun you can have in putting these together. Should we try the next slide?
Anyway, so just in terms of this, I mean, I have this because it's Daguerre and he's important in the history of photography, but you might also have this if you collect matches or, I mean, people collect all kinds of things, and so it's...
I have to ask, where did you find that? It is quite a obscure...
The font of all things, eBay, of course.
Okay. Our sponsor, not.
Again, these are... on this side is a Man Ray poster from a gallery in Paris. And on this side is actually something I bought from these guys when the Armory show, which took place across the street, was made. They did a whole set of postcards that they mailed out promoting the show. And so that's a postcard from the Armory show.
I think we got it on eBay.
This is really interesting. So this is Jacques Villon, who is Marcel Duchamp's brother, who was also a French artist, lithographer, and this is was made from a family daguerreotype from the 1850s. So it's a piece of art, but it's an interpretation of an old photograph. You'll probably recognize this. We won't be using these much longer, but this is a subway, New York subway card, a Metro card with great. A famous Alfred Stieglitz photograph on it. The other side is the you recognize as the yellow and blue, the thing with the stripe. It's Metro card.
Yeah, I mean that's real ephemera.
Yeah.
I think that's the thing with ephemera too, is it's can be so relatable to us all. You know, everyone's held one of those. It's the object.
Where do you keep all of these wonderful things? Where do they live?
In boxes in my apartment.
Are you ever tempted? Well, I'm sure you've scanned a lot of them, but do you ever scan things to show when there are objects like that? Or
Everything is scanned and online. I have everything on
the ephemera included?
Everything.
Ah,
yeah.
amazing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Some of it's a little harder to scan if it's three-dimensional, but yeah, it's all online, and that's the easiest way to keep track of it. This is interesting. This is was a handbill made by a photographic studio in New York in the 1850s. Jeremiah Gurney was a famous photographer, and they printed up these phony sort of $100 bills as a way to advertise the gallery. This is not, they're rare, but there's probably another half a dozen or so by different photographers. It was a common thing to do, but it feels like a...
Did they throw them around on the street so people would find them? And,
that's right, yeah.
Well, that's like an interesting part of it too, is the dissemination of ephemera.
Yeah.
You know, whether it's given out or picked up here or taken off a lamppost, you know,
Something that was just throwaway becomes
Yeah.
valuable all of a sudden. Yeah. It's beautiful.
You want to go to the next one?
Marriage certificate, was very common. You could buy these forms and then have your photographs taken and pasted on there and framed on the wall as a marriage certificate. And this is actually a very early renticular photograph. I couldn't scan both sides, but it's one of those things, if you look at it, it changes, the picture changes. This guy actually invented this process. His name is Deeks, you can see it at the bottom there. And I also have the original patent for it, and I have a bunch of these.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I was thinking also about the carte de visite, which is sort of one of those bits of ephemera that's kind of been in there with sort of curators and museum collections for a really long time, and yet that is also photographic ephemera. It sort of somehow became more accepted within the kind of, I guess that's an early photographic object. It became more integrated into museum exhibitions earlier, I think.
Well, it's actually interesting because there's carte de visites are very common. They were little calling cards that were made 2.5 inches by 4 inches starting in the 1850s. And you have a photograph on one side it started off with famous people, like baseball cards. Famous people would go get their picture taken. I think the Napoleon III, started a craze in England, and then it was a collecting thing where then you could have your own picture taken, and it was really the first time when a person who was a commoner could have a picture taken just like royalty. I mean, Queen Victoria sold millions and millions of copies of carte de visites, and you'd buy them and put them in albums with your own picture and pictures of your friends. So it was kind of like, a social leveling thing in a way, and they exist by the millions, literally. They were very popular in the States, and they're not expensive. There is a show coming up at the Met. April 10th, the Met bought a big collection from a dealer named Willie Schaefer, and it included a lot of really rare and interesting carte de visites. So put it on your calendar. At April 10th is when it opens. It's going to be a really interesting show. Yeah.
I think to your point, it was kind of categorized as a format. There are these sort of different types of photographic formats that, I guess, due to their uniformity, became kind of collectible fields. People were collecting CDVs, they were collecting cabinet cards, which is a similar thing, just slightly larger, or stereo views, which were the three-dimensional cards that you'd view through a viewer. So I think maybe that was what allowed it to become, more integrated into the museums, was the sort of
It's
uniformity.
interesting because it sort of came at the same time as like postcards and early sort of tourism. It's sort of the Victorian era in a
Yeah.
way,
Yeah.
wasn't it?
It was the penny post when in UK when they invented the penny post where you could mail something for a penny is when those things really got popular, postcards.
And I just want to make it accessible also because we're talking about collecting for everyone. Just as we go to just talk a little bit about price of things also, just so people understand. I mean, obviously we know things. I don't know, carte de visite, when they're that sort of accessible and in the market, like what sort of...
You can buy them anywhere from like 100 for depending what they are.
But then they go up.
They
and up
can
and
they
up.
can go up into the thousands depending on the rarity.
No, there's sometimes you'll see, oh, this is the earliest baseball card, and that sold for $100,000 at auction, but it's not a baseball card; it's a carte de visite of a baseball team, and so they go, it can go from pennies to, what do you think? What's the most expensive one?
It's probably the subject matter that...
Yeah,
makes
yeah.
it.
Well, actually, there was at Swan last year. There was a J.C. Ball.
Oh, yeah.
J.C. Ball was a African American photographer in Cincinnati, who's very collectible, and there was a carte de visite that they thought might have been a self-portrait, and I think it went for $70,000 at Swan.
100,
which is a crazy price. All you need is two people who want it
Right.
badly, but
And I think one thing that we were talking about earlier in terms of ephemera collecting is that the particular challenge of it is the shaping of one's collection, because it exists in such a large volume and it is so relatively accessible. If you want to, in terms of collecting forever, and if you want to start thinking about this, and it's a difficult question to answer, and sometimes there is no one answer, but what is the collection? How do you end up with something ultimately that is greater than the sum of its parts? And I think this is, what Patrick has, an incredible example of that, of these individual things. You say, well, this costs $5, this costs $20, this was $100, but you look at it in its entirety, and it's like, it's an amazing record of the history of photography, and its breadth and quirkiness.
And the conversation between all the pieces in a way, or some of the pieces.
Right.
I mean, that's when they start talking to each other. So have you got any more of your goodies to show us?
I think
Or-
actually one last thing on price though. I do think the postcard from the Armory that we sold Patrick, it was definitely under the money. Whatever we sold it for, it was definitely too cheap. I'm sure of that.
well, what did you pay for it? That's the question.
Oh, we lost money.
I'm sure.
We
I'm
just
sure.
we knew it was going to the right place, so we cut you a great deal.
I mean, also one thing about eBay is that the values are all over the place, and a lot of times on eBay, you have dealers who deal in this stuff all the time, and they know what the values are, and they price things correctly. And other times, you'll have some antique dealer or just anybody who found something in the attic and think, oh, it must be worth a lot of money, and they'll put it on eBay for $10,000, and it's worth $25.
Yeah.
And so you do have to know a little bit about what you're buying.
Yeah.
This kind of stuff is not particularly expensive, and
No.
the values are all over the place. Depending on whether other people are collecting that kind of stuff.
And I think postcards for me was like a great place to kind of start. Just printed postcards, you can find such great images on them, and like they cost next to nothing. You buy a postcard for 25 cents at an antique store or $3 or $4 on eBay, and there's tens of thousands of them, so you can shape, as Dan was saying, you can shape your kind of eye and your collection to whatever you want it to be, which is
And
interesting.
I mean, it is notable, I think, that you guys have set up your gallery with this kind of specific, area of photography. It's not. There are not so many galleries doing what you're doing, actually, are there? I've seen a couple of French ones at Paris Photo, for example. But what inspired you to take the leap?
Well,
You go.
all right. Well, I was actually working next door at Swan, And the head of the department there, Dale Kaplan, who was really like a mentor of mine, she had kind of championed vernacular photography by unknown practitioners, and kind of utilitarian and albums. And so I was already interested in, postcard imagery and kind of like ephemera through looking at some photographers like Walker Evans, who had been a huge collector of signs and postcards, and so I think that was what really drew me to Swan. And like when I got there, really kind of diving into the vernacular sort of section of it there, and sorry, I've lost my train of thought. But I think I don't know. I think also being right. One of the big things was I was studying photography, and I came to this point where I decided there's so many images that have been made already. Curating those existing images is just as compelling as making your own. And I guess the type of imagery I decided that I was interested in was so much of this kind of utilitarian photography and postcard photography and things like that. So,
yeah, I agree. I mean, I think a big part of it was these connections. I know Ruchet is a big, influence on him, himself, and how the gallery operates in terms of, using this imagery. But I think also too, it was like, when we started, we said, look, we're not going to be, we don't have, we can't get the Ansel Adams, we can't get these, brand name things, and so we just have to find the material that's the most unique, that's the most compelling, and that, through sheer force of will, we're going to find the stuff that no one else has. And that, I think that is the, ultimate, I mean, that is a goal of ours in many ways, is to bring something forward that is at once, relatable and understandable, but, no one has seen before.
Yeah, it's been recontextualized a bit.
Yeah. And I think that is how we were able to start out the business, of just by finding, if it's finding unique, photo albums and photo collections and vernacular images and things that, are compelling to us, and we would, hope are compelling to others.
And do you think, I mean, I guess this is a really bit of a broad thing to say, but given the shifts that have happened in photography themselves, the sort of the younger generations getting drawn back to the sort of objectiness of the medium, not just the print, but the older printed matter that contains photographs.
I think so, definitely. I mean, we really love it when we're at a fair or someone's in the gallery and they say, this is the first photograph I ever bought, or they go to a show and say, I didn't think I would be able to buy anything here. And, here's something that I really love that, is really cool, whatever it is. But yeah, I think that is, as things go more and more digital, I think people are really drawn to these objects.
I mean, I think also as, photography has grown as a collectible, and the big name photographers, the prices have gone up, things have gotten very expensive, but the sort of range you guys are in, you've been able to find really interesting things that are affordable. And I think, it's a generational thing. That my guess is that you probably have a lot of younger collectors who wouldn't be buying Ansel Adams, but are drawn to the kind of thing just because that you do, just because it's it's different.
Yeah, I think once you've sort of seen it in a textbook, it's lost its allure a bit. And we've seen the Ansel Adams, the Edward Weston, and of course a great print. Vintage print is an amazing thing to see, but looking for a new way to tell that story of the history of photography was always something we were after. And I think that's why we built a relationship with you so easily, because you were also kind of looking at telling that untold story.
And you guys had things that were cheap.
Yeah, that's
we love deals.
We have to be competitive.
Yeah, exactly. Gotta, undercut.
Yeah.
And of course, we're seeing it more in museums. I mean, I talked about the carte de visite, but obviously now there was a very big show on zines, in fact, at Brooklyn Museum a couple of years ago. So it's becoming much more integrated, I guess, into the photographic storytelling that goes on within the museum space as well. Talking of which, the mugshots imagery, there's a fantastic show on at the Met at the moment, isn't there? Is that still on in? Yeah, Jesse Grimes in conversation with historical, I think, 19th century mugshot
Oh, right, yeah.
work, which is a really fantastic curation. Yeah.
This is interesting because usually mugshots are 2 photographs, a side and a front, but this is actually taken with a mirror, so they didn't have to take 2 shots. I've never seen this anywhere else. Mugshots are something within this field that are, they used to be thrown away, and now, the municipalities are getting rid of their stuff, and guys like you are buying, up, and they're fun. To look
I
at.
think this one brings up a great point too about like artists who are kind of looking at this material and referencing it. I think like the Surrealists or Man Ray or Duchamp, like they would have been looking at this kind of thing and kind of recreating it or kind of, I don't know, just collecting it and sort of referencing it in their own work. There's the those 5 mirror postcards.
Right, yeah.
And there's a famous one of Duchamp where he sort of sat in front of a mirror that shows yourself at all angles, or you look like you're sitting at the table with yourself.
The other thing we haven't talked about is snapshots. That's become a very big, what they call vernacular photographs.
Family albums and things like that.
Well, or just, you go to flea markets and somebody have a box of, personal photos. There's a New York collector, Peter Cohen, who has a huge collection of snapshots and has very cleverly done a thing where he contacts museum curators and says, you can come to I'll give you as many photographs as you want if you'll make a show out of it. So they all come to his place and they look through his collection and they find a theme and so he's had museum shows like all over the world based on snapshots, which he buys basically at flea markets and eBay and places like that for not. They used to be really cheap. They've become very collectible and so the prices are going up. But that's another field. That's
Yeah, I mean, photography, I think, is, it has a million different uses. And that's something that was quite important to Dan and I early on, was looking at all the kind of different ways photography's been used throughout its history. And I think now that is being re-examined, within the market more so, when the market for photography really developed in the 70s, it was just about the kind of name brand art photographers. But I think the museums have opened up to being more interested in all this kind of ephemeral, imagery and so on. So
I'm racking my brain. I'm having a real mental block. If anyone can help me, there's that photographer who's been doing or rather, he's not a photographer. He's an artist working with slides, color slides. Thank you. Yay. Fabulous. He's actually just done the Martin Parr documentary as well. He's a Brit living in France, and he actually creates these installations now. With he did an amazing one in Arles about, was it 5 or 6 years ago?
the Anonymous Project, is that his? Yeah. We were talking
the
about
Anonymous
this the other day.
Project.
Yeah.
Fantastic name as well. But he basically created Arles is this fabulous photography festival in the south of France. I do recommend a visit. It's annual, and they have a lot of they put their exhibitions into old churches and warehouses and other kinds of places. And he basically took over a home, and he did an installation of color slides. Wow. And he put them into all kinds of interesting contexts. But again, it just shows the creative capacity that you can find with the sort of the anonymous found ephemeral object, which was thrown away essentially and has been repurposed in a really interesting way. Shall we have a look at some more?
Yeah.
So again, this is on this side. There's this is a poster from an exhibition in the 50s, which it would have been very early for a museum exhibition about photography at the V&A. And on the other side are two interesting things. The top one is a celluloid button. It's about 8 inches in diameter, and you could have you could go into a studio and have your picture taken and have them make a button like that. So it's a little too big to wear, but I don't exactly know what the purpose is, but they're very common. You can find those on eBay all the time. The one below is not so common. It's a photograph on a sand dollar. Somebody, there used to be, and maybe it still exists, there's a liquid photosensitive emulsion you could paint on things. So somebody painted that on a sand dollar and then exposed it to a negative.
Wow.
That's pretty obscure.
It is.
Yeah.
There's, yeah, that's.
But you love process.
Not a
don't
lot
you?
of collectors
So,
have
yeah.
those, but.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
the possibilities are kind of endless. Let's see.
Oh, here we are.
There you go.
So this was something that we had in our first show at our gallery called Used Photos, which was about, why people take pictures, the myriad of reasons someone would make a photograph other than as an art object. And so this is one of the earlier pieces that it's the Lincoln Conspirators, Lewis Payne and the rest of them. Not even sure that first one's right, but what's they're early examples of documentary photography. Alexander Gardner went to the ship where they were being held before they were going to be executed, took their photographs, and they're these compelling, amazing portraits of the convicted men, but these are the proofs that were rephotographed to be used as a composite image that was produced as a carte de visite. And, we just thought this was this kind of amazing example of the midpoint between one kind of photograph and another. And, what else is there? And, well, you go ahead.
Well, I was going to say they're all actually physically overpainted and kind of embellished to bring out certain characteristics or whatever for the eventual CDVs that were produced.
And is that a crop mark, or what's that on the one on the?
The one on the
bottom?
left, I think, is
Yeah,
Left.
it's a crop mark.
or is it like from some old frame or something?
I think it was. If we found the completed example, we could see. But yeah, it's sort of generally you'd find this kind of overpainting, airbrushing and things later on later press prints. But to see something this early and something that's so iconic in terms of the history of documentary photography and 19th century photography was, we always thought they were just great objects, and framed them as such, and framed them individually, and wanted to highlight their object quality.
Fantastic. And I think, obviously, I think these are the first ones we've seen framed, the first objects framed up, because, that's the question of whether to do that or not, or what the right way is to treat.
I mean, I think that with this kind of material, like, there is no right or wrong. It can be in a box, it can be in a sleeve. Like, it is nice to hold these things and see them. Often they have, information on the front and back. But, because this was a show in the gallery, we decided to frame them. But as Dan was saying, frame them up without a mat over them or anything, so you could really see the whole object, and each one is a unique size and shape, and is just this kind of interesting aspect of the photograph, which is inherently not unique as a unique object.
And I mean, we've sort of touched on where you find these things, I mean, all over the place, but are there, for those of you interested in sort of digging into this a bit more, where do you find these things other than eBay, obviously, which you keep mentioning?
They're actually this weekend in Old Greenwich, Connecticut, is the Ephemera Society Fair,
That's right.
Where
The place
all
for
this stuff-
ephemera.
A wonderful weekend of lectures and there's a trade show on Saturday and Sunday. I think it's a preview Friday, and that's a great place. These we found right next door at Swan Auctions. But it was in a historical photography sale, and I did, there was something we kind of thought, okay, we can recontextualize this a bit in that these were being sold in, for their historical value, and we kind of said, okay, well, if we represent this, highlighting its artistic merit and its photographic history, perhaps we could put it in front of a collector who would not have seen it when it went up for sale in auction. So,
And what did you put them in conversation with in your exhibition?
Well, there might be a few
Yeah,
other
let's-
things in this slideshow that were in that. Let's see. Okay, these were not in that show, but
But let's talk about it.
all right. So on the left is the first reproduction of a photograph, which I believe accompanied, in this periodical, The Mirror, accompanied a description of, well, Patrick might have to correct me, but
it's, April of 1839 is really early. In England, photography was announced in January, also in France. And so, but they couldn't reproduce an actual photograph. So this is actually was made by putting emulsion on a piece of wood, on a wood block that an engraver would use, exposing it. This is what's called a photogram because it's not a camera. They put a fern on top of that, and then he used that block to make a woodcut. So that's actually
like the sand dollar, making a photograph
yeah,
onto the
exactly.
object, and then
they made a photograph on
Yeah.
wood, and then they used that as a pattern for a woodcut, so that they could then print it in the magazine. So, but you can't. It's hard to realize how revolutionary this was in 1839 when people got this magazine and they saw, well, this is actually a reproduction from nature, which they had never seen before. So that's a really
Two
early,
size.
rare, important.
And it was interesting that they actually used a brown ink. Everything else in the magazine was black ink, but to, reproduce the photogenic drawing to its true likeness, they decided to use a brown ink, which was kind of a cool part of it. And then on the right, it's just a little postcard flyer that I got years ago with 2 attached photographs of these convicts that were wanted for murder who had broken out of jail. And I just, I like the detail in it. Moyer is a cowboy and will probably seek employment in that line. Is also a violin player. Grady is apt to be found in gambling places. It's just, it's very Western Americana, and just thought it was cool.
And the photographs there, attached on, they aren't printed with that. They were adhered to the postcard. And your guy on the right's a cigarette fiend, which,
Yeah. Yeah, so thinking again about this object and, the sheriff probably making these up in his jailhouse to send out to all the different post offices around the county.
And these are 2 examples of posters that utilize photographs by some well-known folks. On the left is an exhibition for a show in 1906. That's all
So yeah, it was a funny thing. It was a Steichen work that was made, if I to try and get this right, but I think it was produced, or he made the piece to enter into a competition that was put out by a photographic lens manufacturer, I think, and the people judging the competition were 2 of his good friends, so he won.
But it's a beautifully printed poster, and the photograph itself is there are examples of the photograph as some gum bicarb,
Yeah.
which it's probably what a $200,000 photograph. But the poster itself, if you can't afford that, the poster is, I think there was one at AIPAD some years ago for 15 grand. I don't know. But so it's the poster's still a valuable thing, but
still very rare.
Yeah. I mean,
Because as we've sort of talked about with the ephemeras, like so much of it was just thrown away shortly after it was produced. So I think finding these pieces, that's where some of the inherent value comes from, that while they may have been produced in large numbers at the time, they, don't really exist.
Right, and it's also, I think there's something about the fact that the artistry, the art that was being advertised, there needed to be a level of artistry in the work to showcase that, right? To advertise that. So it's
hard to tell here, but it was gold ink.
Yeah.
So to get the likeness of the original work, which had, I think, sort of gold pigment or something. But, as we had talked about before as well, like both of these posters were not just printed in the kind of cheap way that a poster standardly would be. The one on the right, the Kruger, was a really amazing silk screen that we had owned for a short period of time.
I mean, there's whole galleries just devoted to the art of the poster now. After all, aren't there? I mean, movie posters in particular. Yeah.
But also, I do think the exhibition poster is something that is gaining an appreciation, particularly as you're saying, as the real thing is getting more and more untouchable. I feel we've noticed, people our age and younger are really, drawn to great exhibition posters.
Exhibitions, movies, bands as well, I guess, could be another.
Yeah.
It's all like a real thing from the time that whatever was being advertised was existing. So.
But obviously the graphic sensibility in both of those is really amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
And what's next?
All right, what's next? Okay, so this was in the used photos exhibition as well. We had a series of these from this Edward Mitchell postcard company, and they were all, similar to the Gardner conspirators. They were all overpainted silver prints that were kind of the midpoint for creating postcards. And
so this is an area you love, the over painted. Yeah. So should we explain a little bit about that? Because from my experience, working at Magnum Photos, there was obviously, with the press print, there was a lot of retouching that was done, hand retouching done on press prints to kind of bring out certain aspects of it and so on. But this is a slightly different thing, isn't it? The sort of painting over of photographs.
Yeah, it really is the kind of early Photoshop, whether or not that sign at the right really did say bar, we don't really know, but it was put on there to, it was accentuated on the postcard so that people really knew there's a bar here. And I think, it was the way that people could alter images to say whatever they wanted or to show whatever they wanted. We had another one in this show that was a cove in California or Washington or something, but the whole thing had been collaged from 3 images to make this kind of amazing looking cave that probably didn't even exist, but it was like, come here, we have these amazing things.
I think a lot of times also in this period, the original is a black and white photograph. Color was expensive and hard to reproduce. So if they wanted to make a color print of some kind, they'd start with a black and white photograph and then add the color to it and then, do a color separation and print it that way instead of being able to, they couldn't take a color photograph and then reproduce it. So they kind of made one.
I think it's a good time to also mention the fact we were talking earlier about this fabulous show that these guys have contributed to, actually, which is at the Rijksmuseum on the history of American photography, or American photographs, actually, it's called, I think. And it actually contextualizes and brings in a lot of this kind of ephemeral material to talk about the sort of consumer driver, really, of American photography since it began. But I guess works like this, for example, might find their way into that show.
And let's see.
There's been 2 big articles, one in the New York Times and one in the Financial Times, that have reviewed this show recently. I think it's on for a while, but the curators visited a number of times, didn't they, to source material from you?
Yeah, they both the two photo curators at the Rijksmuseum were really committed to acquiring the material at the ground level, and it talks about it in the New York Times article that they traveled by bus and wanted to experience America in this authentic way. And there's this really wild ephemera show out in Allentown, Pennsylvania that happens twice a year, and it's like in a big convention center. Have you been?
No, I haven't. I'm going to go
too
there.
lowbrow, but it's like a down and dirty thing. And we were at AIPAD last year, and one of the curators said, "Oh yeah, tomorrow we go to the Allentown show." And I said, you're going to Allentown? Really?" And he said, "Yeah. When we tell Americans we go to Allentown, they think we're crazy, and when we tell them we're taking the bus, they think we're really crazy." But the show is so I mean, from what I've seen of it, it's really paid off in that it really tells this story of the history of photography using this material that one can. The best way to get it is out
Yeah,
any way you
find
can.
it from the kind of high-end art dealers. You
No,
have to find
but-
it down where it.
Yeah.
And I'm conscious of time
Oh, sure.
because I want to give some time for the audience to ask questions. But if we can click
All
through
right,
a
well,
couple
let's go
more, but
through
just
quickly. On the left is this collection of matchbooks that I put together over a period of time because I found a few of them and I realized they were all being created by the same guy, and he had this kind of format, and it was all gas stations and motels, and it really keyed into the kind of Ed Ruscha aesthetic that I was, or still am, very interested in. So just something that you can buy $2, $3, $4 at a time and put together, and all of a sudden it's sort of an impressive collection. And on the right is this really early map that was made in 1905 for automobile driving, which was obviously pretty much a non-existent thing then. So Dan and I were talking about the ephemeral nature of that, how it would have to update
You would
every year because the
Have to
roads were changing every 5 minutes, and this
throw
was
out the old
literally
one.
to drive around and use the photos to get where you were going, kind of like an early Google Street View or something.
Yeah.
What else do we have?
One of our favorite things. These are Christmas cards from outlaw motorcyclers, and even the one percenters need to wish each other Merry Christmas. And so this was something that we got from a guy who collected motorcycle culture, outlaw motorcycle culture, and again we it wasn't cheap. I forget what we paid, but we thought putting this in the photographic context is just great. I mean, no one else,
The recontextualizing is I think the key to all of this. This is a good slide. So this is the Ansel Adams coffee can. This one I brought from home. It's where we keep our tea bags. And it was done in 1969 by Hills Brothers Coffee. And, it has become a kind of icon in pop Fotografica, which was the term that Dale, my boss from Swan, had coined. And it was about, objects that incorporate photography. And she really, was quite responsible for bringing this into the market and kind of treating it as an art object. And on the bottom there is an unmolded version that Dan and I had at AIPAD last year, and we found a very happy buyer for. But it was just really cool to see it in its flattened, pre-molded state. And then in the top left was an Ansel Adams print that we had that was reproduced on an Awani hotel menu, and we had sold those two together. But again, it was just very cool to see the object that it was kind of reproduced on, and I think the print was beautiful, but there's just as much merit kind of framing up the menu and kind of having that as an object.
He was a pianist at the hotel.
Oh, was he really?
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he worked there for many years.
Wow.
I think what's so funny about this actually is for so long, certainly me I can remember being on a stand, for Magnum Photos, trying to have those conversations, having those endless conversations about the reproducibility of photography and the problem with the reproducibility of photography for those people that were uncomfortable with collecting sort of unlimited, uneditioned work. And yet here we are talking about exactly that, the amazing width and breadth and kind of exciting things that you can do with photography. And really that's what the ephemeral space is all about, isn't it? Yeah.
Celebrating the reproducibility of it.
I'd like at that point to actually open it up, if I may.
Yeah.
Can I show one more
Yes,
thing really
go on,
quickly?
go on.
Just to the end, we can. This is the last one. This is a semi-recent acquisition that a guy consigned some material to us. That a lot of which he, the flyers from events he went to, things he pulled off of, street signs and things. And I said, "What's this?" He said, "Well, it's a poster that William Wegman painted when his dog went missing." And I said, "No way, really?" He said, "Yes, it really, so he hung it up in the East Village, and my buddy took it down in, I guess, the late 70s or early 80s. And, and just in terms of photographic ephemera, I thought, wow, that's hilarious, and it's something that you can, frame up. There's not much to say about it other than it's cool. It's hilarious. Yeah. No. Yes. Anyway, so.
Brilliant. From that extremely obscure but wonderful object, questions?
Would the moderator please tell us when and where is the annual AIPAD New York show taking place? Oh, thank you so much.
I actually think Lydia, who's the director of AIPAD, should stand up and say hi.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thrilled to have AIPAD members, AIPAD collectors, AIPAD collaborators here. Thank you all for joining us. We hope you'll all join us at the photography show in April 23rd to the 27th at the Park Avenue Armory. Yes, where Daniel Oliver Gallery will be exhibiting many of these things.
And also, do the panelists want to tell us anything about their galleries or current work?
Well, we're working on getting our booth ready for AIPAD.
Yeah. So we have some fun surprises lined up. We have one thing that is really cool, but you'll have to come to AIPAD to see it. But we've got, we're very excited about something that will be a centerpiece of the booth, but we just have to figure out how to frame it.
And before AIPAD, we'll do the Antiquarian Book Fair, which is also held at the Park Avenue Armory in early April.
Yeah, that's like the 3rd through the 6th, and many of the albums and the other more historical or archival photography that we deal with will be presenting there, and we have some fun stuff there too. Yeah. So come on down.
Last year I was at the Armory and I stopped by your booth.
Thank you.
Patrick brought me over there. And what I'm kind of curious is, I think the audience should know you do more than photography, right? I remember as a photography collector, I didn't buy photography at that booth. I bought this amazing album by a high school teacher, do you remember, who did these color patterns of wallpaper and what have you. So people should know it's more than photography when you come to Oliver and Daniel's booth. And I will say they have amazing stuff. So as a collector, I recommend you going.
Well, thank you.
Interested.
High praise.
Thank you.
Yeah, but that's a lot of what we will kind of show at the book fair that you were at last year, and again, that fair for us was kind of about recontextualizing, our material within that kind of fair and to that kind of audience. And I think we've had success there because we stand out like being the only people that are really showing primarily like photography and other interesting book adjacent material.
Hi.
Hi, Mark.
How you doing, Ollie? Good. No, I wanted to ask, thank you, this is great. I wanted to ask about, we're talking a lot about, or in the beginning at least, fine art and vernacular. And I think it's really interesting with photography, that distinction. When is it fine art? When is it vernacular? I think it shoots through the history of photography. And I think for me, whenever I've seen the things that you collect, the first thing I notice is aesthetic. Gosh, this looks good. And I remember one I have from you about, it's a Phoenix City Police, you know this? And did a drug bust. And they have an image of the doctor, or sorry, the police officer dumping the drugs from his hand on the table. It looks like an advertisement for drug use. Like, and so I wanted to ask about this. When you're collecting ephemera or looking at ephemera, how do I put it? These things are good photographs that were used for ephemeral purposes. I don't have a good question. What do you think about that?
You know, okay, I think that sometimes, you know, like, particularly there are ways in which people talk about vernacular photography, that they say there's famous people and there's anonymous, you know, which is more in the sort of snapshot, you know, and I think we're kind of committed to saying, no, there's a whole breadth of, you know, commercial photographers, you know, working photographers, people who were very good at what they did, but they considered what they did, a craft or a trade or something like that. And I think, you know, I personally enjoy, you know, when you can make up the placard or whatever, and it says, you know, right, like so-and-so, you know, then, you know, next to the Walker Evans, you know, there's a name next to this is, you know, Joe somebody. Who was that? Oh, he was the photographer for the police precinct. You know, it's just kind of like, I do think there's so many reasons pictures are taken, and there's so many people who are very talented at what they did, and, you know, there's so much more between the fine art and the kind of, you know, accidental beauty, which is a great thing. But, you know, I think we're interested in expanding the definition of vernacular, applied, utilitarian images to include something like this cool sounding photo that you bought from us, you know, or trade it, you know. So yeah, I know that for me is a big part of I think our mission is to look at a lot of people who are in between, you know, the working photographer and the fine art photographer. And by contrast, you know, I think we're both really interested in the ways in which fine art photographers, you know, did things for a paycheck. And I think that, you know, in that show at the Rijksmuseum, right, it has a lot of commercial work by Evans and other folks who, you know, because it's like, it's easy to say there's artists and then there's, you know, people working for a paycheck, but the line is blurry, and it always has been, so.
Do you also think about the outsider art market?
We do, yeah. We've done the Outsider Art Fair a few times. We didn't do it this year, but that is, you know, it has been a great place for us to show anonymous photography and kind of other vernacular photography. And then, you know, these canonized outsider photographers like Wilson Bentley, who spent, you know, a huge part of his life photographing snowflakes through a microscope. And someone like him, you know, he was a kind of scientific photographer who was obsessed with this, and he found his audience within that kind of outsider art world. And but, you know, in another context could be seen as a kind of like vernacular photographer, or, you know, again, it was kind of the utilitarian like element being that he was a scientist. And but yes, so I hope that answers the question. Yeah, exactly. Anything to add to that?
No, it's true.
It's true.
I agree with it all.
I don't know that this was necessarily super pertinent to the conversation, but as someone who is in fine arts insurance, this is something that I'm really interested in. But I was wondering what you think your biggest issues or risks are with preserving these pieces, because you think of things like baseball cards and matchboxes, and there are things that you might typically throw away if you get them brand new. And so I was wondering, what do you see as the most common ways that you might see a piece damaged? Is it climate? Is it wear and tear?
I would say one of the most common ways is that it's in a huge stack of stuff, and the corner has been creased because it's under 500 other
500.
photos. And that's often how this stuff, gets to us, is like a huge box of, we might buy a box with 1,000 photos in it and kind of go through it all, and you just hope that the one that you really fall in love with isn't the one that's torn in half.
I would also say bad framing.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I
Bad
can't tell
framing
you
is
how many
huge.
times we've bought something and thought, gosh, the person who framed this must have spent, $500 to get it framed, and it's ruined. It's incorrectly.
Particularly posters.
Yeah, it's incorrectly mounted. It's, we talked to a woman recently who said she got something framed and the guy cut the signature off so it would fit. And that's an egregious example, but quite often you're not going to know the framer. The framer is assuming you're not going to see the problem until you take it out 20 years later, or So I don't know. I'd say, framing's a hard thing. It's hard to find at an affordable price, but I think it's really important that you make sure.
If you value the thing, you've got to spend the money to get it framed, or you keep it in a sleeve and
Right.
put it in a box.
I'd also add that, in this kind of thing, condition is not necessarily the most important thing. These are things that have been used, and it's nice to have something that looks brand new, but in a lot of ways, sort of a worn condition gives it some character and some history.
It's the story of its life, isn't it?
Yeah, with a fine art print, you're going to always want the best print you can find, but with this stuff, quite often you can't find anything that's in great shape,
No, you
but
take it as
also
it comes.
it gives it some character.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Hi there.
Hello.
Do you worry about archivalness with any of this? Do you treat it, or do you just let it go the way it is?
When we find something that we love amongst, all this other stuff, we put things in archival sleeves. We have endless stacks of archival sleeves, and I think that's the best way of preserving it until you go to the next step.
Yeah, something like that.
Would you ever have something conserved, in order to make it more saleable?
Yeah. That Steichen poster, we had some conservation done on, because some of the gold pigment, you can't really see it, but in the upper right corner towards the right edge, some of the pigment had gone, and we had that conserved at Paul Messier in Boston.
Yeah, and it always, if it's something, whether it's for resale or whether it's something that you love and, it needs a little work done, if it's a poster that maybe needs to be linen backed or, some in painting and a photograph, it's never, if you go to the right place and if you love it, it's never a bad idea, to go the extra step to preserve it or to,
I have to say, as a collector, since usually I buy things and put them in boxes, I'd rather save my money to buy more things than to spend the money to have something conserved right now. I'd want to make sure it's stable, but I don't, I'd rather, if I'm going to loan it for an exhibition or something, I'll have it conserved then rather than invest the money now,
And I think it's worth adding that so much of this 19th century material, what damage might have been done from the glue or whatever else, like that damage is done. It's not, I think there is a time period in which that kind of degradation happens and then, it stops happening. So at least that's what the conservator has told me.
We'll end with one more question.
I'm just curious, how is your gallery that operates, in ephemera photography, how is it different, how is it operates as a business, and how is it different from, for example, a traditional fine art gallery? If you want me to sign a non-compete agreement before answering, that's fine, but I'm in a very different business.
Well, I guess, we don't do a ton of shows, and that's maybe an understatement. We hardly ever do shows in our gallery. Most of our sales are done through these fairs and are done direct to institutions, museums, special collection libraries, and, collectors like Patrick. So I think, but I think most galleries would probably tell you most of their sales are done to institutions and museums as well. So I don't know how.
I think also, we acquire. We don't really represent artists. We at AIPAD last year was the first time we represented a photographer. Most of what we do is
we buy it all.
Buy and sell.
In that sense,
barter.
It's a bit more of an old school gallery approach. Everything that we are selling, well, 99%, we have bought to sell. So it's there isn't much consignment and there isn't much working with living photographers because we don't do that.
And I think also too. It's something we do the book. We do the Antiquarian Book Fair, and we do kind of sort of float between a few different worlds, and I think that is what excites us, and is a even though the main focus is on photographic material, if a beautiful collection of color palettes from a school teacher from the 20s shows up, we're not gonna not sell it, but I think that.
It's similar in our approach, in the reasons that we like photography because it has many different uses. That does at times mean we have to find many different ways to sell that type of photography. So whether it's the outsider art fair context or the book fair context or selling it on eBay.
I think both of us, both of the people whom we consider mentors, I think taught us the breadth of what's out there, just in terms of, this David Winter, who is a mentor of mine, who's a pioneering figure in vernacular photography, but also, works on paper in general. And I think I came into this personally, not seeing the, the boundaries or some, between many of these different forms. So I think that just informs how we operate. I think we have more and more felt the interest in being public. We're not that public facing, but more recently we've said, wow, this is really, to get this stuff in the hands of people, and because the public facing things that we do in terms of our.
It would be more of a shop than a gallery in some senses. So.
So I would wrap that up by saying I would encourage any of you here to come and obviously see the gallery present at AIPAD, visit them in their space. You also heard it here first. I believe Patrick may be hosting some AIPAD guests during the fair at his archive. So that's an opportunity for any of you to sign up to. Thank you all so much for coming. I think we've learned a lot this evening, and thank you very much to our panelists.